All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. Recently, I finished up a series of about 75 videos that I created for Murox ASP.NET 4.6 with C# 2015 6th edition. And the last chapter that I went over was on the Model View Controller Architecture, MVC. And during that time, I mentioned that there kind of is a movement underfoot to change the focus of the AWD1111 .NET framework with Web Databases class to give it more of a MVC focus. So I decided to go through a couple articles and maybe even go through a demo on MVC, albeit a fairly simplistic one. So this is an article from Code Project, so it's not really, it's new, fairly new, May 31st, so it's about, it's a week old. Here we will understand what MVC is and how it's different from web forms. So this is the author's take. So anytime you read something like this, will it exactly be the way that you feel or I feel? No, it's their own bias, but I think this is well written. Again, this is from codeproject.com. Tips 118-9762. What is MVC and MVC versus web forms? So what is MVC? MVC is the Model View Controller. It's a software design pattern. It literally has been around for about 40 years. It was the creation of Xerox back in the mid-70s. So what is it? What does Model View Controller stand for? The M stands for model in MVC. As it says, it's a set of classes that describe business logic. In other words, it's what is going to interface directly with whatever is your data store. Most people equate data stores with a database, and oftentimes it is a database, but it doesn't have to be. It could be something like a spreadsheet or a comma-separated variable file or something else. So that's the model part. The view are the web pages that you eventually want to display to your end user. Now, not always, but typically the view is going to consist of HTML, but it can also be CSS, jQuery, etc. The controller is, we mentioned this before, it's kind of the traffic cop. So every request that comes in to an MVC application comes to the controller. The controller then requests information, data from the model, and it sends that data to the view. And then the view will send it back to the user who requested it. So when we say that the controller is like a traffic cop, there is no direct communication, or shouldn't be, between the model and the view. Rather, it all goes through the controller. Now here's a picture, and I don't exactly agree with the picture, but it pretty much is the way I think it is. Actually, it's pretty good. The request comes in from the user, it goes to the controller. All right, the controller requests information from the model. Okay? The model gives that information back. The controller then sends that data out to the view, which sends a response back to the user. So HTTP request, HTTP response, typically HTTP. Now there's a dash line here because, again, there is not direct communication. So it says here, what is ASP.NET MVC and how is it different from web forms? MVC for ASP.NET is based on the MVC design pattern, which we just discussed. It's not a substitute for web forms, but it's something that can use to augment or be used with web forms. What I liked about this particular article is what they have in here is a series of comparisons between MVC and web forms. So let's take just a couple minutes and go over these. Is this complete? No. Is this biased? Well, somewhat, because it's written by an author, and I'm not saying the author has a bias, but the author is putting in there basically what he considers to be the most important points. And I'm not saying I disagree with anything the author has said here, but it's like any article that you get. All right? So, one of the biggest advantages of MVC is, as mentioned there, it focuses on separation of concerns. There's no fixed code behind the page for any view, and a view can be called from multiple actions. Whereas with web forms, they're based on functions and page behind code. You know, the ASPX and the ASPX.cs code. There is a code behind page for each view. With MVC, first the request comes to the controller, and then the view gets called. With web forms, first the request comes to the view, and then it goes to the code behind page. MVC provides HTML helpers to create form controls. They're optional. You can use HTML controls. With web forms, everything basically that you want to do that's going to go to the server at least, you need server controls for. Number 4, probably number 4 and number 1 are two of the biggies. Number 1 being separation of concerns. Number 4, there is no view state for state management in MVC, where view state is used to maintain the state of a form in MVC, in a regular forms app. This makes the page heavy. Well, with this lighter page that you get with MVC, as it says, it's good for SEO-friendly URLs, whereas with web forms, not so good for MVC or for friendly URLs. You could have partial views. That's not that big a thing for what we'll be going over at least. It's very easy to use jQuery, which should really look like this, and JavaScript, and CSS for that matter, whereas it's much more difficult when using web forms. Maintaining the ID of form controls is much easier than it is with MVC than it is with web forms. Now again, that was all probably object, I don't know. This was just meant to be a very simple little introduction. That's all. Okay, if it helped at all, great. There's the first article. I didn't find anything on W3 Schools for MVC per se. Probably the closest I got was for their ASP tutorial. There's some talk in here about Razor. All right, if that's something that you might be interested in. Now, before I go to that article, Learn ASP.NET in MVC Style Part 1. This was meant to be a several-part series, I believe, that turned out to be a 2-part series. And this person had been working for a while with web forms, and they decided to teach themselves ASP.NET MVC. So this was kind of their trials and tribulations that they went through. Again, some of it is very similar to what we've already seen, such as there's the model, which they call the business layer, responsible again for data access. The view, which is the interface of the application, which renders the data from the model to the user. And the controller, which again, the most important part of the app, it's the part that does the coordination between the two. On this picture, and I've seen this picture before, what I don't like about it is there typically should be no direct communication here. plus these arrows really should be going in both directions. Kind of like this. The author gives a real-world analogy, which you may or may not agree with, but I kind of liked it. The author says here, consider the case of a professional photographer who has been asked to take a picture of a bridge for a promotional event. To take the picture, the photographer must use a camera and focus on various angles for the perfect picture, which will eventually be displayed to the world at this promotional event. So the bridge is the model. It's what's providing the picture or the data for the event. The camera is the view. Its main purpose is to capture the picture. And the photographer is the controller who is responsible for the end result. I kind of like the way that was. As far as a couple objectives of MVC, extensibility. The idea is that when you have the separation of concerns, if you decide you want to swap out the current model or the current view, etc., it's much easier to do it than when these things are too intertwined. Remember that when you set up, and we'll see this in just a bit, when you set up an MVC project, if you want to, you can set it up for immediately to have test-driven development set up. Separation of concerns I already mentioned. And there's a URL routing mechanism where it's more of a smart URL, which is much more SEO friendly. Now what they have you do in here to create your first app is they just literally, all they do is they have you choose MVC and add unit tests. And with a change authentication, and I'm going to do this, if you click this, this is what you get. So if you click that and you choose the no authentication, for example, you won't have the login and the register buttons. The default is individual user accounts when you do have the login and register buttons. You can have organizational, so if you want it set up for your school or your organization, and you can set it up for Windows authentication. If you choose source control when you do all this, and I don't remember where source control is, but you can use Git or Team Foundation version control. The bottom line is you get this. And when you run it, it looks like this. It looks very similar to a quote regular unquote type of ASP.NET Web Forms project. Now they go in here and they talk about some diagnostic stuff. I'm not going to hit any more on this article at all. All right, that's it for this article. But I want to go a little bit into part 2 of the same article. And literally just a couple pages that are in here. This one is on the controller. And the author mentions the controller is the most important part of really any ASP.NET MVC framework. It's responsible for the overall flow of the application. And the author mentions in here that if they simplify it by going through the difference between using a web form app where you have to basically set up where you want the basically a full URL where you want to go, as opposed to a smarter URL, which is defined with the request response pattern. And the author mentions there, instead of targeting files placed on the root directory of the web server, it maps the URLs to special classes called controllers. That's what this is all about. So the controller, as mentioned here, is a special class that inherits from controller base, and it's responsible for the entire flow of the application. Now the author mentions here this idea of convention over configuration. And this is a Wikipedia link, but the idea there, it says it's a software paradigm used by frameworks that attempt to decrease the number of decisions that a developer using a framework is required to make without using flexibility. Bottom line is this. What the author is saying here is we'd like to automate as much of the procedure as we possibly can. So the controller provides public methods that respond to incoming HTTP requests. All right? And we're going to look at a project in just a couple minutes where we're going to do that. All right? A couple more things that I wanted to mention before I go into that. All right. Those are, when I created the website, the initial website for the AWD1000 Web Technologies class, I went out to HTML5 boilerplate.com. Well, since then I found out, and I've not done any work with this whatsoever, but there's also an ASP.NET boilerplate where they say you can use it as a starting point for web applications. All right? And it mentions there that there's a sample application, and it says you can see it on GitHub. I didn't look at it. I did nothing with it, but it is out here. All right? They've got some, it says sample projects, and each is in its own README folder. So it looks like there are some examples here. I'm not going to do anything with them because I don't know how they work or anything else, and I might end up embarrassing myself. So, but I'm not going to do another lecture on this, but you might want to go out to codeproject.com, articles 768664, Introduction to ASP.NET Boilerplate. All right, I'm going to keep that one up because I'm going to look at that one later myself. I also found a couple more articles out here that I really haven't gone through too much. You'll notice I'm a big advocate of using codeproject.com. I like the stuff that they have in there. I shouldn't say, virtually always I like the stuff that's in there. All right? There are sometimes the articles are either too simplistic or more often than that too complex to use. But this is an absolute beginner's tutorial on ASP.NET MVC for web forms. Again, it's a little dated, about 4 years old, but it's under codeproject.com, articles 575397, an absolute beginner's tutorial on ASP.NET MVC. All right, there's a sample in here which I have not looked at, but they talk about some stuff in here. I did read through this. It's pretty good. It's not 100% up to date though, and it really, you wouldn't expect it to be, again, when it is over 4 years old. This is another similar article, which again I found out on codeproject.com, ASP.NET MVC for beginners in web development. A year newer, so it's about 3 years old as opposed to 4 or so years old. All right, much of the same stuff. What you need to work on this, what are frameworks, what is MVC. They go through an example, which again, it's not that it's a bad example, but as mentioned, again, it's a little bit dated. All right, I think I'm going to stop that here. And what I want to do is spend just a minute and show you this. Now, let's see. Let's go to course content. We'll do this. What I am going to do is a basic replication of what's in here. Now, I went out and bought this course. Not sure what happened there. Copy. Yeah, it was all there. Okay. All right. Well, for whatever reason, I'm having some trouble here, but this URL is out at udemy.com/create-an-asp-net-mvc-application-in-and-hour. All right, there are 14 lessons that are in here. I'm going to save that. They have you design a database. Well, they give you a short introduction. Then they have you design a database, generate a data entity layer, and I shouldn't have clicked that. Design a database, generate a data layer with the entity framework, change the user interface, customize the user interface, deploy your code. I'm not going to go over that. But the author has a nice section here that's about 10 minutes long on what is ASP.NET MVC. I am not saying this is my work. In fact, I'm saying this is not my work. I would strongly suggest that if you want to learn about this stuff, you go out to udemy.com. They often have their courses for $10 a course. That's what I paid for this. Create an ASP.NET MVC application in an hour. What I got from that, among other things, if I can find it, okay, I'm taking some of the author's notes here, which I just like the way that he put this stuff. This was in that 10-minute long presentation. So, ASP.NET breaks programming down into model views and controllers. First released in 2009, so it's with ASP.NET MVC 2. It says the current release is 5. This is a little dated, this particular course out on Udemy. It's really 6. Again, I don't totally agree with the picture here because I agree with it that MVC is a way to organize code. I agree that it delegates responsibilities, so it's repeatable. In other words, we talked about that pattern where you do the model, then the controller, then the view, model, controller, view, etc. The model structures the data for the app and typically interacts with a database. The view presents data to the user and is the presentation layer. And the controller is the traffic cop. I agree with all that, but again, there really is no direct communication here, and the arrow here and the arrow here, they should be arrows and they should go in both directions. Razor is relatively new. I think it was ASP.NET 3.5. It's a markup language, but notice what it says. It allows you to add server-based code to your web pages. In a way, it's kind of standing this idea of separation of your concerns on its ear. It has the power of traditional ASP.NET markup, but it's easier to learn. Easier is a relative term. You can use it with C# or with Visual Basic.NET. Advantages of ASP.NET MVC: it's a lighter weight framework than web forms. We talked about that a little earlier. It allows for tighter control over how the HTML is rendered. It's highly testable. We already talked about that good separation of concerns. And again, we mentioned before that if you are a web designer, you can work on the view part. If you're a web developer, okay, you can work on the controller part. If you're a database person, you can work with the developer, and you can work on the model. And there's very good integration with JavaScript. Some of the limitations of ASP.NET MVC: there's no visual environment right now like there is for web forms. You must have a fairly good understanding of JavaScript and jQuery. There are not a lot of pre-built tools. And there's no way right now to automatically convert a web form to an MVC program. ASP.NET MVC is living and growing. If you go out to Microsoft's site for ASP.NET, which is ASP.NET, you can go out to ASP.NET/MVC, and you'll notice that if I do that, so if I go out to ASP.NET, whoops, not there, ASP.NET/MVC, this is Microsoft's stuff. And there are all sorts of, here's a getting started with 11 tutorials. Here's that video series that I'd shown before. If you go out to videos, there was a thing here, I thought there wasn't there. Videos, okay. Some of these are old, but there's a lot of stuff in here. So if you decide you want to learn this, and as I progress in my own career, I'm going to be spending a lot of time here. All right. Again, this 8-hour course is a little old. This Getting Started has 11 tutorials. I've gone through some of this stuff. This is that movie project. What I think I'm going to do is run all this off, take a look at it, and if I think it's worth it, I'll go over that with you also. All right? But before I do that, so I already gave you that site. There's the Channel 9. I did not look at this, and I know that Scott Hanselman has got some really good information out on his blog. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build or attempt to replicate the project that the gentleman here does in this class. Okay? It won't be exactly the same thing. I'm telling you that from the get-go. It won't be exactly the same thing. And I've done it before. I got it to work. I'm going to try to replicate what I've done before. I had to put in my own kludges, my own fixes, so to speak, to get it to work. All right, so some of the stuff that I'm going to do, could it be done in a better way? Definitely. Not sure what that way is right now, but I'm going to come back and show you this stuff in just a couple minutes.